measuring isn't changing. And so if we wait too long, maybe there's just some natural change in what we're measuring. So we might not want to wait too long of a time period, but on the other hand, there might be memory effects. If we administer the survey, today and then tomorrow, if people remember what they put, what they do like, it would be put the same thing. So I don't think I've seen a guideline, in terms of it should be 2 weeks or it should be 1 week, but textbooks would just say we have to be concerned about if what we're measuring changes and then if there might be memory effects. And it also becomes kind of further complicated because, maybe we would measure an attitude towards something at one point in time, and we get a true measure of their attitude, but maybe that prompted them to learn more about the issue. Or maybe we administered some survey to a class and they were talking about the issues afterwards, and then it caused some to change their views on it. So it might be an accurate measure of what we're trying to measure, but if it's changing, we're going to get different measures, and we wouldn't be able to tease that out. So there's definitely some issues with that.
And so what would happen if it doesn't match up?
Well, I think you'd be left with that question of, well, was it because the survey instrument wasn't reliable that what we're measuring didn't change, it's the survey instrument's fault, or was it because what we're measuring changed? And we'd have to probably do some further investigation to see if we can answer that question. But you'd be left with that question. That's basically going to be unresolved and assessing reliability. So
is this something you would do as like a pre-test? Maybe survey some people and then survey them again as a test to see if your survey was reliable before you took it to a larger group?
Yeah, you can do that. Yeah, it's not something that you would do for, if you sent out 3,000 surveys. Do that.
But if you sent out 3,000 surveys, you might select 100 people and
you could
test
do that.
them.
Yeah, that would be. You could use that as an assessment of it. There's I recently did a large mail survey where we were looking at how often people participated in recreation activities and where they participated in recreation activities. And we sent out several waves of we sent out a survey and then we sent out another one after a few weeks. And then we kind of knew which surveys were coming back. And sometimes people would receive get one and not fill it out right away, and then they get another one, and sometimes they fill both out, or maybe they mailed one in and they got another one because we didn't get their survey in time to take them off the list. So we got some surveys back from the same people, and then we could look at this sort of issue where the responses were similar.
And?
They were pretty close. And so yeah, pre-testing or maybe a small subsample of what you're doing. Or maybe it's, if you're like in an educational setting or something, you could use it in that sense.
Do you ever include questions that are like covariates that might affect how the people are answering the questions? Like I was thinking sometimes if I take a survey, I might answer what would make me answer differently.
Mm-hmm.
Like maybe if I'm stressed out or feeling tight on time or tight on money. Are those questions that you throw in there as kind of covariates to gauge how people are answering questions?
That gets to an issue of validity. And so if you're, tight on time, you probably would be that trait or that characteristic would cause you to be the same on all the different responses to the survey. But the issue comes in that maybe that's a reliable. Well, if we're doing like some sort of internal consistency test, it might show up to be reliable, but we might not be measuring what we're intending to measure. Mm-hmm. So there's different ways that we could test for that. I guess typically we wouldn't, we want to be aware of those conditions, but we typically wouldn't ask, are you stressed out today or something. But it might be if we were administering a math test that we used a lot of word problems, and we had had some, let's say it was like 8th graders, and we had some really high level vocabulary in there. Well, then it's probably a test of their vocabulary rather than their math ability. So then, you know, we have a validity problem. And so that's where that question is raised. To overcome some of these problems with the test pretest method, what you'll see as a method in most texts is what's called alternative form method. And this is where we would administer a second survey to the same individual, but rather than having it be the same exact survey, we have some other survey that's supposed to measure what it is we're trying to measure in an equivalent manner. So we have the test at time 1, and then in the second time it's a different survey, but measures the same construct or concept. So if it's like an attitudinal survey, we would have 2 different surveys that are supposed to equally measure the attitude towards this object. But designing these different surveys that are equivalent can be difficult. So it eliminates the memory effect, but we sort of have to, it'd be sort of a judgment call as to whether or not these are equivalent forms of the survey.
By memory effect, you just mean, how did I answer that question?
Yeah.
I answer it the same.
Right. So another way to assess reliability is what's called split half reliability. And so this would, how we do this is we would develop several questions that measure concept of interest or construct of interest. I'm sorry, I'm using concept and construct interchangeably here. You probably picked up on that already. But then we would divide the questions into 2 groups and correlate the results. So let's say we have 8 questions that we're saying would measure, I believe it's predator control again, as an example. So if we have 8 questions that measure someone's attitude towards predator control, we could take these and divide them into 2 groups. And in this example, let's divide them by even and odd numbers. And so we're judging these questions to be equivalent in how they're going to measure this attitude towards predator control. Then we can correlate the 2 versions of the survey. So we get the average of scores and then correlate those versions of the survey. And hopefully we would see there to be if the test is reliable, we should see a strong correlation. Part of the issue that you raised, though, is if we might see, if this is a long survey, maybe people get tired towards the end. And so dividing it by odds and evens, that if someone's getting tired towards the end, it would even itself out in how we split it. But if we split it first half, second half, then we might be picking up that issue that people get tired towards the end of it. So the advantage of this is that the survey can be administered at one point in time. But there's many different ways to split up these questions. So depending if we get odds or evens, you know, the first half, second half, or divided into quarters or something, we might get different correlations between them. Given that the test retest and the alternative forms and the split half are kind of cumbersome to use, what we see most often there is a test of internal consistency. And that's where within a survey we examine response patterns to a specific set of questions. And then the idea is similar to correlation. There's just 2 questions that we're asking what we could correlate. Most often what we see is a statistic called convex alpha, which is sort of the average of all inter-item correlations. But basically what we're doing is we would have, let's say we have these 3 questions on the survey which were intended to measure reinforcing self-image. We're saying that these questions are all related to reinforcing self-image. Let's say we ask someone to rate the importance of these 3 items as a reason for engaging in, let's say, about skiing today. And so we might have 1 being not at all important and 7 being extremely important. So if a respondent answers, 2 on the not at all side, not at all important side of things, to one question, we expect a similar response of the other questions. So respondent 1, they were sort of at the not at all important side of the scale on all the questions. Respondent 2, they were on the important side of the scale for all the questions. You can see that the response patterns. And so hopefully we'd see some consistency in people's responses.
So does that use similar numbers to like a Pearson's correlation, for example, like what you would produce from Cronbach's alpha? Or?
Yeah, what Convex alpha does is you can use it with, so if you had a correlation coefficient, you can just do 2 at a time. Convex alpha will come for all 3 of the variables, but it also corrects for attenuation, it corrects for unreliability in the measure, and the measures. So it's slightly different than the correlation